Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the Southwest Center of Human Relations Studies at the University of Oklahoma in Norman. My name is Debbie Odell, and I'm delighted to welcome you and be your host this afternoon. Our hope is that we continue the conference tradition of working to improve racial, ethnic, and intercultural relations on college campuses and community organizations by providing virtual learning with opportunities like this one. For those of you joining us for the first time, NCORE has monthly webinars on the first and last day of each month, with the occasional exception like today due to holidays. Some of our webinars are free and others are offered at a modest fee of $25. Our next webinar is Co-Creation and Collective Action Through Art, Activism, and Healing on Stage. It will be presented on December 7th by Laura Abraya and Amanda Goodnow. Please visit our website for the full list of webinars for this season. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you need to utilize closed captioning, please make sure that your settings are set to on. Always remain muted unless you've been requested to unmute. And we ask that your background have no moving images or flashing lights. Please report any specific tech, accessibility, or any other operational concerns via direct message to me, the session host. Now help me to welcome today's presenter, Tanya Williams.
Thanks so much, Debbie. And I want to say thank you to all of you who have tuned into this webinar, whether it be like right now live, or if you watch it a little bit later. So glad that you're here. So glad that you are wanting to understand and think about and keep exploring the ways in which we've been conditioned by racism. And we'll do a little bit of that today. And there's so much more, but I'll talk about that more in a second. I'm going to share my screen, and I will be sharing my screen for a good portion of the session. And so I hope that that still provides people to have opportunities to have the interpreters available and seen, but also be able to see me as well as we move through today's work. Thank you for that feedback, Adderley. So the workshop is called Unbound, Freeing the Self from the Conditioning of Racism, and it's a workshop for people of color. And so I'll talk about this more later. I recognize this as a webinar. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will only be people of color in this space, because this could be used as an opportunity to gather people on campus. It might be used later. I'll talk more about what it means if it is used in that way in cross-race spaces, cross-power spaces. But it is really it is really directed at the experience of people of color in a system of racism. It won't include any video. I won't be doing any video or flashing lights or loud music today. So just in case you have any wariness about that, that won't be a part of the presentation today. And as we are moving through today's work, I will leave some time at the end to answer questions, but a way to help me kind of pick those out in the chat, if questions come up for you as I'm speaking, as I'm sharing, if you could use a little Q with a colon in the chat when you put your question in, I can find those a little bit easier when we get to question and answers. I know that it's sometimes hard to hold your questions as we're moving through. And so that's a way to like ask your question, but also let us keep going. And then we'll come back to those at the end. And I do invite questions and comments, conversation. Feel free to use the chat in that way. I do ask for people, and I facilitate almost daily on these topics. I do ask people not to create a whole other chat conversation, but use chats more as this is my share, I'm lifting up and celebrating something else that someone else has said, but rather than going back and forth in chat. So want to do a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to read this, and I've added a little bit to what NCORE offers. But the land that I am on I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and the land that I am on and inhabit and reside in is physically situated in the original ancestral homelands of the Lenape people. I pay respect. I hope that you pay respect to the people whose land you are on, the homeland, the ancestral land, the indigenous folks whose land you are on. If you do not know those who it is, there's many ways to search, and there's many ways to continue making connections with indigenous communities in the area and learning about experiences. What I added is that I think that it is important to commit to extending beyond the acknowledgement. And so I looked up acknowledgement. I love a good word. And so the acknowledgement is the acceptance of truth or the existence of something or someone. And so we, in doing land acknowledgements, we are accepting as truth that this land in this process, this history that we on, decimated people, destroyed families and homes, and a record of forced removal and immigration. We're acknowledging that we can actually commit to extending the acknowledgement by our understanding that the land and the people live, not only like legit still exist, but also it lives in us. And how are we actually a part of the land as well? And how can we make our connections to the land and the people and each other in deeper ways? Zoom also now provides you opportunity to choose whether you share your pronouns or not. And so some people might have their pronouns already up, but this offers a clear way to show that you can add them into your profile. On the rename, you can actually just do that right now if you use the 3 little dots that show up when you run your cursor over your picture. But you also can go in, and I just found this out myself, and put them into your profile. And it gives you an opportunity to choose whether you want to share your pronouns with each meeting that you join. And so we invite you into that. With the number that we have, might actually get some conversation. We don't have a ton of time, and I like to hear from people, and we'll get a couple of opportunities to do that in more silent ways. And so one of those ways is by having you check in with yourself. It's the end of the day in some places, it's the middle of the day in others. Knowing that you chose into a conversation about internalized racial subordination, the ways in which we have been conditioned into racism, what feelings come up for you when you think about exploring that? And so there's a QR code for you to access here. And in a moment, I will add a code, a link to the chat that will allow you to respond as well. But I want to give people a chance to use the QR code. And it's just, we're creating a word cloud, but it's just going to help me get a sense and help the community get a sense of how are we feeling about even exploring this? Because this isn't particularly light. There's a reason that internalized racism, I have a Google notification set that whenever internalized racism is mentioned, they send me a kind of note. I don't know if anybody else has those, but I get maybe one every, 6 days. And so, and it's not an extensive understanding of internalized racism. It's usually internalized racism that's just used in a sentence. And so we're going to do a little bit deeper dive than just the surface. And I want to understand how people are feeling about that. So I'm going to stop share and make sure that we have the link that you can use so that you can access it. And then I will pull up the Mentimeter that will give us information about that. So check the chat. I'm adding the link right now. Either you use the QR code and they're coming in, or you can use that link. And so I'll share my screen again so people can start to see, one, you're not alone. However you're feeling about this, not alone. And you know, with word clouds, the words that show up the largest have been used multiple times. I always say it doesn't mean that the other words are not included and important. It's just that it's just information for us to know that the words that show up the largest, multiple people have said. And so we'll give this a second to kind of fuel itself and just notice how people are feeling coming into a space. And I just want to let you know again, this helps you know that you're not by yourself. And this word cloud has some words that I've seen in other moments. And so I really believe that there is a reason, like, this work is so necessary. This healing work is so necessary. And there is a clear reason why we don't do it more often. I have it as sort of my, I guess it is kind of my purpose in life, that we feel differently about exploring internalized racial subordination so that we can actually experience the liberation that is available to us all. So I'm going to invite a few more people just to share. And once you pause, and once this is paused, just take a look. As a person who loves the movie The Matrix, every single one of those movies, actually, I love the mention of ready to leave the Matrix. And in some ways, this kind of work invites you into that experience. But I'm noticing anxious, anger, unsure. I saw someone mentioned should know better. The should have known better the feeling that comes with should have known better. I will say it, and I'm gonna say it now, but I'm gonna say it again, that this system, every single thing it does, and I say the system, and I'll say very, very lightly again, it is working, and that's why the Matrix is such a good movie. It is working to keep itself in place. And so anything that you're feeling, I'm going to invite you into some compassion. I'm going to invite you into some, empathy for yourself, self-compassion. Anything that you might be feeling, know that it's not about you. It is absolutely about the system, and it's what the system, we have been just really great students of the system. And now we get to decide not to be. A few other ones, I see tiredness. I love the acknowledgement of journey. This is not overnight work. This is not, I'm going to do this in 5 years and I'm going to be, done. It is lifetime. If it does, it is vulnerable work. And I think it's interesting in a webinar format, because I'm not going to be calling on people and having them speak. Webinar might have you be able to do some of this work and feel less vulnerability in front of others, but there still may be vulnerability that shows up for you. Uncertain, exhausted, scared, present. I love that, like bringing some presence to this, that it's a needed conversation. Change is needed now. And I am of the belief that our change actually comes in multiple ways. And in this way, we get to move this work up more forefront than we've had it, so that the change can be felt. So thank you for having responses to that. And I'm going to go back to the slides so that we can kind of move forward a bit. I want to introduce myself a little, and I will in a second. But I do want to share this because, like I said, this can be difficult work. And so there are a couple of skills that I want to make sure that you practice. One of them is holding complex thought. And so I know, being socialized in a system of supremacy, white supremacy, male supremacy, all kinds of supremacy, it keeps me in a very binary way of thinking, that there is a good or a bad, a right or a wrong, a black or a white. Even in our conversations, it's like we can see, we don't often talk about the ways in which different experiences of being raced in the United States show up different than black and white. We haven't been very able to hold the complexity of mixed race people and folks who identify as Asian, or folks who have black and white, parents, and might present in one way, but identify in another. We haven't done really well in being able to hold that complexity. It is a skill to actually practice holding complex thought. So really notice when you want to go to, and even, going back to the word cloud, someone saying, I have that feeling of, I should have known better. That's a binary. And so what's that complex? It's like, oh yeah, I wish I could have known better. And I know that I was socialized in this system, and that movement that we can be in this. So we don't go to the right or wrong, or that I'm good or bad because I haven't looked at this. That's not going to serve us in this work together. Also, another major part of this work is noticing what's happening in your body. And a lot of people have been, or at least in the areas that I've been listening, a lot of people are talking about somatic work, and this workshop is not on somatics. And understanding that the body has been present for every single experience that you've ever had. And so as much of as my psyche has taken in, my psychology has taken in any of the socializing and conditioning of racism in this particular body, this body has as well. And so there may be moments where my heart starts beating fast, or the pit of my stomach, I talk about my stomach dropped, or my hands are sweaty. That's just the body giving you information. And you don't have to have a judgment about it. You don't have to actually name it. I have loved practicing, like, wow, I feel my heart beating fast right now. And just stopping right there, not having that go to anxiety or go to, oh my gosh, what did I do wrong? But literally just saying, wow, my heart's beating. And usually I do touch as much as I can where I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling. It's like, wow, my shoulders are tight. That's enough. But noticing just what's happening, I think, will be helpful. And of course, like I said, gentleness and self-compassion. In doing these workshops for now close to 12 years, one of the things I've learned is a system of oppression, racism, will specifically say racism. Our brains have functioned so in this conditioning, when there is a new thought or a new neural pathway that is being built, I have felt myself. I have watched other people. It's like the brain kind of locks up because it's sort of like, whoa. Um, and then the old conditioning will come in and start beating us up. Oppression uses shame as a function of keeping itself in place, and it uses it really effectively among marginalized group members. And so our answer to the messages and the conditioning in the moment, if you can write down or remember gentleness and self-compassion as we do this work, just keep returning to that as much as you know it, because we could do a whole workshop on gentleness and self-compassion too, but as much as you know it, just keep coming back there. It's not light or passive work. I really, really hope that people will give themselves at least 10 minutes after we finished to ease back into your day or ease into the next thing that you have, particularly if you have a meeting or something, give yourself time to transition. That is a liberatory way of being that this work particularly, I think, requires. So, who am I? So my name is Tanya, and I am originally from Houston, Texas, and I live in Brooklyn, as I've said. And yes, that is a picture of me with my sister and my cousin, Vicky. My sister is the doctor in training. But I love this photo because this is Christmas at my grandmother's house. We had all gotten our presents. And I don't know if you notice their dolls and you notice my doll, they look different. And this is so much of what I think my understanding and one of the manifestations of my internalized racism, how it showed up in my early life. And, you know, I say early life now, I'm 50 years old. So early life was well into my 30s. But white is right is one of those manifestations of internalized racism that would show up. And so this picture, I always pull it out from my workshops because it just captured it so well. I attended predominantly white schools from kindergarten all the way through college and graduate degrees, and navigated an upbringing in the Southern United States, which offers its own kind of navigation of race. When I was in my doctoral work at UMass Amherst, I specifically said that I wanted to explore racial identity and really dig into like, why internalized racism? I saw myself, I didn't understand what was going on, but I saw myself and I knew something was up. And so I did spend my time during my dissertation work researching internalized racial subordination, specifically with Black and African-American women. And I always tell people that my dissertation isn't about internalized racism. My dissertation is about liberation. And I had to study internalized racism to understand the liberation more. And so I'm really committed to the liberation and healing of all people, including myself. And so I come to this work constantly seeking understanding that my liberation is one, connected to everyone else's liberation, and I can't actually commit to anybody else's if I don't commit to my own. So a few notes about this. This workshop, this webinar, is a short form. I think of it as we're rubbing across the top of what is possible in the exploration of this work. It's a very short form exploration. This is actually a day-and-a-half institute that I've done at the NCORE conference, specifically for people of color. And I have done it in, cross-race groups. I started earlier when I started doing it, and I shifted it to a BIPOC and mixed race affinity space, because it really does, I think, offer an opportunity for the protection that we as folks of color might like not even know that we're wearing anymore, to come down some in that space. And so it allows for a different kind of work. I'm currently working on an online version of this that will take folks through different lessons, and I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end. But I do want to encourage, if there are people who are using this in spaces where there are cross-race, cross-power, and by cross-race, I know that even BIPOC affinity is a cross-race space. But if you include white people in the conversation, it becomes a cross-race and cross-power, because systemic power lives differently. And so, not to say that it doesn't live differently even in, but systemically, when white people are involved, the systemic power feels different. And so if you're going to use this in a space that is a cross-race and cross-power space, I recommend that any of the debriefs, practices, or anything that we might do, conversations that you do it in affinity, and affinity first, if not affinity only, because it's a different kind of conversation. Not to say that people can't talk about this across race and across power. It will just be a different conversation. So why conditioning? And like I said, I love a good word. It's the recognition that conditioning is about training or accustoming a person or animal, that was part of the definition, to behave in a certain way or to accept certain circumstances. If that's not what racism is attempting to do to every single raced being, I don't know what is. It has been done. So white people have been conditioned into racism as well. And internalized racial subordination has specifically worked to condition marginalized and groups who have been subordinated by systemic racism into a way of acceptance and thinking a certain way about themselves and others like them to further uphold that system. And so if there are any further former athletes, current athletes out there, I used to play basketball and volleyball in high school, and we had conditioning drills. I hated conditioning drills. But, when I did them, they were designed to help me practice the things that I needed to do when I got to the game. And so sometimes the drills were about, how am I passing the ball? Sometimes the drill were about running plays. Sometimes the drills were about making sure that the team worked together. That's a very kind of neutral way to think about this, but think about all the ways in which we have learned throughout our lives. Again, I said I was 50. Throughout my whole life, I have been given messages by racism that has conditioned not only me and my mind, but conditioned me and my body to keep racism in place. And so this is a way for us to think about internalized racial subordination. Again, we've been good students. We've done, unless we had different experiences from birth, we've done in order to not only survive, but we've also done in order to sometimes achieve based on the system, sometimes to fit in based on the system. And so we've just been conditioned into this. And what I want to say is that we can actually condition ourselves into liberation as well. So I'm going to read this, but it's from the brilliant author, writer, speaker, facilitator, thinker, Adrienne Maree Brown. And I love this quote because it helps me remember, like, oh yeah, my work is not necessarily about going after anybody else. It's actually about healing myself. Adrienne Marie Brown says, what's true is that trauma makes weapons of us, and fools and secret keepers and collaborators in harm. What's true is that trauma is both singular, violent events and the ongoing constant socialization of power over for those deemed superior because of skin or penis or ability or inheritance or something else they didn't create or do. If we are going to grow, we must embrace truth-telling. We must generate our compassion. We must learn to set and hold boundaries within community on this planet we share. We must learn what is worth our attention and how powerful our attention is. We must get more passionate about healing than we are about punishing. Again, could do a whole workshop just on this quote. And it's that last piece. And I guess it's all the pieces that I've kind of bolded. But we must get more passionate about healing than we are about punishing. And the next model that I want to show you has had us, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily had us in this place about punishing, but it's had us focused on things outside of ourselves rather than the healing, the excavation, I really think about like the excavation, the going in and digging out the ways in which I have learned internalized racism. My energy and my attention has been focused out here. And I actually like the real work, the work that is going to be transformative is the work that I can do on myself. So this is a model that was introduced to me through an article from Beverly Fletcher. The article's title is the Internalized Oppression, the Enemy Within. And I often think, I'm like, oh, if we've been thinking about it as an enemy, I don't want to go after it. But this model was introduced to Beverly Fletcher by Dr. Barbara Love, and it's Dr. Barbara Love's model. And the question basically is, how does oppression, finally get defeated? And so if oppression is a two-legged table, the institutional is one leg and the internalized is the other leg, which leg has to fall first? And the way that we often work, we have it that the institutional, we are often like talking about policy change and transformation of, this business or this institution, or we've got to fix media, or we've got to fix theater. And what we don't recognize is that we actually don't have any control, not ultimate control there. And so the leg that actually I think can have the most impact on our experience of, and I want to highlight that, our experience of oppression, not that I do believe that it can transform the ways in which the systems function, because have the people who exist in the system show up differently in the systems, those systems have to change. And our experience of those systems can shift when we do the work of really exploring internalized racism. So why explore? And I'm going to move through, I'm going to put these out pretty quickly. Honestly, why not? Because I'm just trying to get as clear of racism and go after my liberation as much as possible. And there are some clear reasons why we should explore it. So institutionalized racism is not going away anytime soon. I used to always say that, my job as a social justice educator is to work myself out of a job. And it was a really sweet and cute thing to say. And in the back of my brain, I was like, yeah, this is going to outlast me all day. I'm going to be dead and gone. And these systems, because they are deeply embedded, and it kind of connects. Oppression is baked into our system. like they're baked into our organizations. It's baked into our laws. It's baked into, and when we don't explore the internalized, how we've learned the system, we keep playing the system out. One of the things I often talk about with a co-facilitator of mine is there is a way to be oppressive while you're working against oppression. And so you like kind of, it sounds like an oxymoron, like I'm working towards social justice, but I'm practicing oppression while I'm doing that. And so we will keep recreating the same system over and over if we don't actually take the time to understand what's going on. It's literally killing us. It impacts the stress, thoughts, our bodies are impacted by it, the choices that we make to support our bodies or not support, the food that we take in, all of that. It's literally killing us. It steals our power, and I'll hope to get into that, a little bit of that. Our power is inherent. Like I was born into this body with inherent worth and inherent power. And what I know is my experience of my life, living in racism, living in homophobia, living in classism, as marginalized in those identities, my power constantly was stolen from me. And so I will, as long as I allow for internalized racism, internalized homophobia, internalized. And so I'm talking about racism, but I'm recognizing the more that I do this work, marginalization is marginalization. It may manifest in different ways, but power, like marginalization just brings about powerlessness. And so the more that we can unlearn that, the better. It keeps us in a victim state, connected to this powerlessness, and then uses shame to keep us in that victim state. And so the shame kicks up the fear, and it doesn't allow for us to challenge the status quo. So it becomes this really, I don't like the language of vicious circle, but it just keeps us in a cycle that we actually don't want to be in. And then it keeps racism, therefore, and all oppressions in place. So what is it? This is the surface level. I'm going to move. I'm going to believe that a lot of people already have this language. And I know that the in-depth understanding of the ways in which the nature of racism works can be transformative to your experience of excavating your own internalized subordination. And so we know that these are the 4 levels of oppression, and structural or ideological is about, the fact that the very air that we breathe sometimes feels like it includes racism. The images that we see, the ways in which like relationship between institutions just holds the structure in place. Institutional is that policy and practices. So what are the ways in which institutions are set up to uphold oppression? Interpersonal, how does it actually transpire, usually because we've been socialized into it, that it transpires between people interpersonally through the prejudice and discrimination that we, implicit bias that we hold and act out and talk about and think about all the time about others. And then there's the internalized. And I'm realizing, I'm like, I think I want to reverse this and make the internalized the big one so that we grasp that that is the one, because I think that we keep working outside in, and I'm like, start here. We might actually get somewhere. And so the internalized is about how we've taken in all of this and how it lives in us. And so our notions of inferiority and superiority. And so could have done, I want to pull this apart in that in the internalized, everybody has been living in the system people have different locations depending on how they've been raced or gendered or sexed or named by ability or named by religion or named by nationality or named by belief system, all of these things. And because we live in a supremacist culture, power over is the way that we've functioned. And so we have power over relationships in, all of those nested circles. Some folks are valued more than other people. And so people are either experiencing the privilege or dominance, and others are experiencing the marginalization or subordination. The internalized piece allows for us to kind of pull those apart from all of those nested circles and recognize that you can both internalize your dominance and you can internalize your subordination. And it's not that you actually have dominance or subordination, but the experience of dominance and the experience of subordination in systems of oppression. Both can be internalized because I've been living, I'll say this about myself, I've been living in this body that has been raced as Black since 1972. And so I've watched media, I've had experience, I've had things said to me, my parents taught me things that had me internalize and be conditioned, going back to that word conditioning, to it's out of, I'm sure my parents, they were doing the best they could. And they were doing it out of love and to help me survive. And some of the things that I learned, some of the things that I took in just was about me upholding the system. And so we have to know that there's something else that's possible. So Annalise Singh in Racial Healing Handbook offers this quote, which I think is really, really important as we transition to what do we do with it? So racial healing means we begin to unlearn the stereotyped racial messages we internalized about our own race and the race of others. It means we as individuals learn to recognize the wounds that racism creates in us, whether we are white or a person of color. Healing means that we open our eyes to the costs of racism, which are pretty much everywhere, and work to stop participating either knowingly or actively in the system of racism and white supremacy that was designed to favor some people and not others. And so I include this to kind of, give an example of that everybody's been participating in this. So nobody's clear. So everybody has been experiencing costs. The costs look differently, probably some because of our intersecting identities, some because of our own awareness, and everybody's experiencing costs. How do we choose to stop colluding with the system? I think the other thing that I want to say is I use the language, and I used the language when I was showing you the picture, that me holding that white doll and believing that, things associated with white people was right or, good, that was a manifestation of internalized racism. People often talk about it, it's like, oh, that's internalized racism. I think we really need to pull it apart and get clear that internalized racism is the conditioning. And there are many, many, many forms that the manifestation of internalized racism can show up as. So how is it impacting us? And so this is a hard one to do via webinar because it requires some, I think, different kind of reflection. And what I wanted to offer is just a little bit of thinking that I've done on how powerlessness, and I mentioned it it's a reason to study it. Powerlessness is really connected to codependency. And this is not, my original thinking in the sense of Charlotte Castle, whose quote I want to share, wrote a book, gosh, now probably, I think it was in the 80s, where she talked about codependency. And she was specifically talking about internalized sexism as a form of codependency. And that was the first time I had ever seen someone name, internalized oppression as codependency. At the time, it was not the 80s, it was in the 90s, 2000s, but I went back, I had gotten that book from the 80s. At the time, I was actually in a 12-step program, Codependence Anonymous, because I was like, oh, I need to understand my life. And it was about individual relationships. And the more work that I did on internalized racism, internalized racial subordination, it's like, oh, that's deep. We are very much in codependent relationships as a result of being within systems of oppression. So stay with this as much as you can. It's a lot of content, and please ask any questions that you might have. But Charlotte Castle says that the goal of codependent behavior is to find externally the security and power that is lacking internally. And so I'm not a big fan of the whole idea that anything is lacking. So I want to start there. Nothing is lacking. Like, as I said, we're all born with inherent worth. We all keep that inherent worth. We experience life in systems that try to beat that inherent worth out of us. So nothing is lacking. And we can have the feeling that something is lacking as a result of those systems. And so having experience of being subordinated in systems of racial oppression has taught us an experience of believing that the most important power exists outside of us. And so many times I have heard, and I've heard myself, I'm like, if I could just get white people to change, I'll be all right. That is a codependent relationship, because I'm trying to control something that I actually don't have control over. And so what can I do? What is the power that I can actually bring back to myself? It's like, I see that white people, men, heterosexuals, cisgender folks have power in the system. And where's the power that exists for me, so that I can create clear boundaries, state my needs, be clear about my desires in this body, in this experience, in this identity that I have. Second point, systems of power over relationships and institutions atrophy the muscle to know and determine clear wants and needs. And so I know it took me, and I'm still working on it, years to even understand that I could have desires, that I actually had needs. And we think and talk about this sometimes all the time in, our individual relationships, but do we think about it from the perspective of being raced bodies in a system? Do we think about it as, I can state my need as this raced body, I can have desires as systems of oppression being marginalized in those systems. My muscles atrophied around having any kind of wants or needs. And so part of the work is actually bringing those back to life. And lastly, the powerlessness and the fear created by the powerlessness keeps groups focused outside the self, preventing an opportunity for exploration, preventing the opportunity for us to do the exploration that is needed. I have so much that I think I have to worry about with the people that I'm dealing with at work that, I don't have time to look at myself. And if we can go within, the people outside of us at work, in our families, moving through the world, we can actually approach them with so much more clarity, because my power is I am in line with my power, and I am able to speak clearly to my needs. So the other piece of this, and I think I said it, yeah. So our internalized subordination impacts the consciousness, therefore our behaviors, thoughts, ways of being of subordinated groups members. And so what is consciousness? Everything is consciousness, every single thing. And so I'm going to pull on the work of Dr. Barbara Love. If you've read Developing a Liberatory Consciousness, if you have not, I'll put it on the bibliography. Highly recommend that, because she really creates this idea of liberatory consciousness. Just hold that for a second. Liberatory consciousness. Everything, my thoughts, my beliefs, my way of being, everything that I experience, how I experience the world, could be an experience of liberation. It's important work. My co-facilitator and I, when we train groups, we train organizations, and take folks through a consulting experience around liberatory consciousness for the organization, we thought, all right, if we're trying to get people to understand what liberatory consciousness is, what do we actually have right now? And what we have right now is an oppressive consciousness. It is a consciousness that has been just framed by oppression. And so we have been in, places where we've learned, adopted, colluded with the structures. We function often with no awareness and intentionality. And that second paragraph, when held by marginalized groups, and this is just repeating what I've said before, an oppressive consciousness keeps us in a victim consciousness from our own social locations. It prevents us from accessing innate power. When held by dominant groups, oppressive consciousness perpetuates the worldview that everything is predicated on unequal worth, and that's just the way it should be. Maintaining this oppressive consciousness upholds a system of oppression. And so the way that you go about doing something about this oppressive consciousness is that you really look into and work on exploring not only liberatory consciousness, but going after and understanding internalized racial subordination. So what do we do with it? And this is where I'm going to have you engage again. And this is not a small question I'm asking, and it feels a little bit unfair. I do recognize it feels a little unfair to ask this and not give enough time to really dig into it. But I want to use Dr. Angela Davis's reflection here, where she says, we have to talk about liberating minds as well as liberating society. I want to even take that a step further. Yes, I want to liberate my mind, but I also want to liberate my body. I want to liberate my very being. And so what is liberation? I'm using a definition that just really resonates for me. And I think I always try to do a public service announcement. I really want liberation not, to lose its power and be watered down. And so I'm going to read this definition, but then I'm going to take a pause so that people can really read it and take it in for themselves. The creation of relationships, societies, communities, organizations, and collective spaces characterized by equity, fairness, and the implementation of systems for the allocation of goods, services, benefits, and rewards that support the full participation of each human and the promotion of their full humanness. Really take that in for yourself. And this might be a place where you notice what's showing up in your body. Are you able to take a deeper breath in the face of this definition? Is your brain kind of like locking up, like, what are you talking about, Tanya? It sounds good to say, but this is not possible. Notice all of that. So I want to hold that liberation is, we often talk about it as both a process and a goal, but also the recognition that it is about, I am looking for the liberation of a collective experience, and so that of society, that I live in a society that exists with this is as the way that it is described, defined, how I move, this is how I know. And how can I, as an individual, get inside of this as well? Like, not just get inside of this collective experience when it shows up, but recognize that, oh, wait a minute, there is liberation available to me as an individual, and I can show up in liberatory ways in every single thing that I do, including the way that I understand myself, my mind, my body, my psyche, and the experiences and identities of those like me. And so Barbara Love gifted me with something. She was a faculty member of mine. She gifted me with something that I will take, and I have used every single day since. And it's not a thing. It's like I have nothing to actually say, here it is. This is the tangible thing outside of my life. But she gifted me with something by saying, go after your liberation every single day as if your life depended on it, because it actually does. And so I have absolutely used my understanding of what might be possible in this experience of a world, experience of relationships, experience of families and businesses, to actually work on creating that for myself. And so it's not just that we have to go in and excavate. The excavation can actually come from our going after liberation. And so I think, and I want to set that up because a lot of people talked about, I feel not so great about digging into this. I invite you to hold it that you're going after your liberation as you do this work. And I am not a betting person, but I can almost guarantee you that it will feel different. Because I think a lot of times the way that we've gone after it is like, okay, well, now I have to talk about all the ways in which I am ashamed that I did these things. It's like, oh, but when I do that, I am clearing space for myself. I am healing myself. I am recognizing that, that those systems actually don't have power over them or over me in the way that I thought they did. So I want to invite us into a reflection. I'm going to watch my time. I'm doing pretty good. Thank you all for allowing me to chat. I hope that this has been beneficial. I want to give you a moment to reflect, and then we're going to share again via the Mentimeter. And the question is, in what ways have I learned powerlessness through oppression? Again, not a small question. But what I know is that our brains sometimes are just waiting for the right question, and all of these thoughts will start coming to you. So I'm going to get quiet for a moment while I pull up the Mentimeter. You can use the same exact link that we had before. And here's the QR code. In what ways have I, as in you, learned powerlessness through oppression. You might come up with specific ways. I can think of one of the main ways that my parents, and I'll say this is a experience that I've heard across race, so I won't just talk about my parents. Across race, across people of color, people, there was this statement that said you got to be twice as good. And so that was clearly a way that powerlessness was taught to me through oppression. It was taught to help me survive. And what did it tell me? It told me that I would never be enough. It told me that that there actually was never enough. Like I didn't know what enough was. Like I got to be twice as good as who? I'm looking around constantly trying to find people that I got to be twice as good as. And so what are some of the ways that you have learned powerlessness through oppression? I'm going to quiet myself again, let me switch over. Thank you for that feedback. I got to do the switch on the slides. Okay, it should be up now. So here's the link again. And should give you about 250 characters, I believe, or words to write something. So whatever you're able to come to. And, write it in the way that makes sense to you. A couple are coming in, and we're using this more as a witness. And based on our time, might get a couple of voices in to be able to say. So I'm going to share what folks are putting up. Once you can enter, I think you can enter more than once. And so if there are more that come to your mind, feel free to enter those. And once we have enough going, they'll start to scroll so that you can read what your colleagues are putting in. All good, Ruthie. So I'm going to let us just read for a bit. Feel free to keep these coming. These are super powerful, y'all. If you've ever wondered what manifestations of internalized racial subordination looks like, you got it. I think we sometimes get fixated. I know I got fixated early, when I was looking at this work. It was sort of like, well, it's the child holding the white Barbie doll, or the fact that someone may choose to wear their hair in a style that is straighter, and they have tighter curls in their hair, but they wear it straight, or going after a certain body size. Those might be manifestations of internalized racism. And then there's the things that we don't ever talk about that are also manifestations of internalized racism. The things that we actually, because those kind of things, like, that was one of my first choices that I made. I told my mom, like, all right, I want to wear 2-strand twist, or I want my hair braided, but I let go of the perm. And I did that initial resistance to lock my hair and all of that. And it's like, that was still external. It impacted some internal. It's this beautiful article or chapter by Alice Walker. Just freed me so much. And so I did have the experience in rereading that chapter and doing the work. And this was an external, like, visual example of the work that I was doing inside. And there's so many other things. I will tell you that I have believed in this work. I have thought that this work is massively important. And one of the ways that it has absolutely, one of the ways my internalized racial subordination has manifested over the years is that I always believe that people know more than I do. And so I had nothing to share, nothing at all to share. And so I do my little presentations and I know it's been my internalized racial subordination, the work that I keep doing, that has me say, oh no, just put it out there. It's time. But my internalized racial subordination had me like, oh, everybody already knows this. You were the only one that had to spend 10 years of a doctoral process to make sense of this, Tanya. Nobody else needed to do that. So we get stuck on these external things, and it's actually all the internal stuff that impacts the external that we get to actually explore. So I'm going to go back to, and then I want to open it up to some questions. I'm going to go back to the slides because there are 2 more questions. And, this part was, what do we do with it? And I think I'm trying to say is ask yourself some questions. So any of the things that you wrote on that list, someone, I wish I could go back to it, talked about, well, I'll use myself as an example. Challenge the thing that you think you're carrying around as truth. I am gonna put out a course. Who knows what that course will do? I have no idea what this course will do, but I know what I'm very clear on is this is what I've been given to do. And so I'm just going to finally do it and believe that when I do it, that will be enough. And so ask yourself the questions and then challenge that. Challenge it in the way that you can in the moment. I've been thinking about, this work for a while, and this is 10 years later, finally able to move. But I've been moving, maybe minuscule, since then to finally get me to this point. I know sometimes I get in this place of, well, if I don't see immediate change, I'm just going to throw my hands up. Adrienne Marie Brown, again, in her brilliance, says, like, all the world is a fractal, that things, any change that we want to happen large actually has to first happen in the minuscule. And so what's the thing that you can do tomorrow that challenges any of the things that you wrote down? Other questions that you might ask yourself: what ways have I learned powerlessness through oppression? We answered that one. Spend some time, give yourself 20 minutes and just free write, and just keep asking yourself that question and just free write. You might be surprised because off the top, I know what to say. My brain knows what to say, kind of off the top. She's going to give us 5 minutes to do this. And there is stuff at the base, or that's deeper, that when given the space, the body, the brain can call all of that up and have you see some stuff that you didn't even know was there. In what ways am I practicing powerlessness? And so if I learned it, I am actually practicing. And so what can I do that has me step out of that powerlessness practice? In my workshop or in my workplace, my relationships with myself? And then in what ways can I unlearn the powerlessness? Is it choosing to bring more awareness and attention and presence to what I watch? Is it, watching one of Dr. Love's elements of liberatory consciousness is awareness. And then the next element is analysis. And it's not in a linear way, but it's a recognition of, I can watch something. Wow, I can be aware that this advertisement is got these people in it, and I'm not represented at all in this. And so I can bring an analysis of, systems of oppression. This Lexus ad never ever has any people of color in it. And so what does that say? What is it actually trying to get across in society around class and class privilege, and who has and who has not? So it's really, really bringing some small practices. So a little bit more about the Unbound course. It is a multi-lesson course, and actually I need to I'll pull it up when we get into question and answers. It'll be available after the new year. The link that I'll put in the chat will take you to a page where you can sign up and leave your email if you want to be notified about the course when it's released, and I'll send out a discount code knowing that people signed up through this course. And it's video based. It's got some, reflections and assignments, but for me, it kind of connects to something that Audre Lorde says, is that liberation actually does not happen anywhere but inside community. And so I am trying to really work on also having people be able to experience the work together, so that, again, we know that we're not alone. Oppression uses that all the time. It's like, you're by yourself. You're not as smart. You are an imposter. And so we get to challenge that in everything that we do. And this course is really driven, and hopefully will allow us to do that better. I'm going to leave this up, but I want to really open up for questions. If there are any questions that people want to either come off of mute. Again, we only have 43 people. And so if you want to come off of mute to ask a question, or if you want to put it in the chat, we can do that as well. But I'd love to either hear questions, comments, your own thinking. I'll take all of that. See if there's anything in chat. Thank you, Fatima. How do we discuss how do you discuss multiple internalized depression? So are you saying that the experience of multiple marginalized identities? Say a little bit more about what you mean.
Yes, thanks for asking for a follow-up question. Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for your time, your grace, your wisdom. Really appreciated it. In the question I have in the chat, I'm really curious because I know this model is super helpful when we're talking about race and racism. And if we're using like an intersectional lens and we have multiple identities in which there's marginalization there, what does that work look like? Because I know that sometimes it might feel really overwhelming when you're trying to heal and unpack all the things. So would love to hear sort of like your practice or tips around addressing the multiple parts.
Thank you for that. That's a great question. And so I think that's a little bit why I say my entry was through race. And the more that I have worked to understand and I literally can hear myself often saying, I'm trying to understand the nature of oppression. And so the very nature of it, like, how is it staying alive? How is it functioning? What are the patterns that it is teaching us? I'm trying to understand like how it moves, breathes, and works, how it thinks, how it, so that I can grasp like, well, the experience of marginalization in oppression has these kind of patterns. The experience of dominance in oppression has these kind of patterns. The manifestations may show up differently. And so, for example, Black women, queer Black women, identify as queer lesbian. And there are ways that I learned internalized racial subordination that sort of get supported by the ways in which I learned internalized homophobia. And so, or it doubles down on, that marginalization of not being valuable, or the voice not being valuable, or not being able to. And then there are ways that are like, that manifest vastly different. I'm learning so much. I'm taking this course right now about calling in the one. I'm learning so much about how internalized homophobia has impacted my experience of believing that I could even be in a relationship. And so they may manifest differently, but I grasp that it's all the ways in which marginalization has impacted me in these marginalized identities. Now, intersecting identities, I also am carrying around some internalized dominance. But if I understand how the nature of oppression functions, I can go to my able-bodied identity and say, oh yeah, so dominance might show up in expectations around the needs that I have, or not really considering, the needs, and I'll use our wonderful interpreters as examples, not really considering the needs that are there and in place to support people who have different abilities than I do. I could completely not care about that. So really understanding, like, that's why holding complex thought, it is really creating this flexibility of mind and flexibility of body and flexibility of energy. We have to be able to do that to function and kind of outsmart systems of oppression. Because if we're stuck in this binary, we're stuck in, well, I'm only marginalized. That's not true. I'm only experiencing internalized subordination. That's not true. I have internalized some domination too, and I need to understand that as well. So it's actually a very complex question that you asked. And I think it is possible, but we have to be able to do it with a flexible mind and a deep, deep understanding and a continual trying to seek and understand the nature of oppression.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, Vicki, the slides will be shared, and Debbie's going to put those up. I think you'll have access, and Debbie, correct me if I'm wrong, you'll have access to this video online, and then the slide deck will be there with the bibliography that I'll include as well.
Yes, that's correct.
Awesome. Thank you. Moments of liberation that I have felt and recount from my research. That's a nice long conversation. My research, I can remember. So I would say radical in that I included myself in my own research. And so I had a friend of mine actually interview me. I had a whole research process where I interviewed people 3 different times. And it's a particular type of qualitative research, but as I was going through the experience of interviewing all of these great folks, I also was being interviewed so that I could see my own process as well and talk about my own understanding. And I can remember during that process feeling moments of oh, it's not anybody else's, because I went into my dissertation work, I went into this absolutely from the belief that I'm going to interview some people who I think are liberated, and they're going to give me and I don't like this, the answer. I was about to say silver bullet, but they're going to give me the answer. They're going to tell me what I need to do to live the most liberated life possible, and we're going to call it a day. And I remember distinctly having a moment where I'm like, oh, it's not up to anybody else, it's up to me. And that was a moment of liberation. I can remember sitting in a coffee shop. I would write on Sunday mornings and go to the same coffee shop, sit in my same window, one of my favorite places in the world. And I can remember the day when I was writing in my research journal and I heard myself, an internal self, a very deep internal self that didn't know that this question even existed in her, said, who are you without this identity that has been framed by racism? And I lost it in the coffee shop because I was like, I don't know. I actually do not know who I am as a Black person that only has existed in racism, or that has only known themselves to be my whole life, my work in the world is to fight racism. There was this deep internal self that said, who are you without that? That was a moment of liberation. I experience and I work towards my liberation all the time by choosing into vulnerability, sometimes choosing into courage, taking care of myself. I have COVID and I am facilitating right now. I canceled stuff yesterday. I canceled stuff because I was supposed to facilitate every day this week, cancel stuff tomorrow. Those are choices into my own liberation. A couple of years ago, no chance that would ever happen. It would have been like, well, I gotta make sure I do this because if I don't, the client's not gonna want to work with me anymore. All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, actually through lots of work and support, this week has felt so freeing. I knew I wanted to do this. And so what did I need to choose in order to be here and present and ready and able? I could tell you about lots of moments of liberation. I'm gonna get as many as I can in. So I'm looking, Aretha, at yours. I'm wondering what your response to PWI's practice is. Well, so that's, thank you. Practicing naming feelings. So if the space can't hold your feelings, it doesn't mean that you can't hold your feelings. It doesn't mean that you don't have actually relationships, or you build relationships with people who can hold your feelings. And I have a lot of response behind that. My simple response is keep naming. Right before this, I had a workshop, and a colleague of mine said, the body is the vehicle that we go after our liberation. Like, this is the vehicle. Think about it. If I'm going to go from one place to the next, I need some way to get there. Sometimes my feet are the vehicle, living in New York City, sometimes a car, sometimes the subway. This body is the vehicle that will get me to a more liberated or liberatory experience. And so everybody may not be able to hold and hear and stay with the feelings. And actually, I don't know that I want to necessarily share them if you can't hold them with me. But you can always tell yourself the truth, and your body is listening.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm hoping that was helpful. Got 2 more minutes. Let me see if I can get to anybody else. But how can we connect, support, and show up for others as we do this work? Yes. Thank you, Natalie. Not codependent, but interdependent. And I think we sometimes get that confused. And so how do we show up for folks doing the work is that we show up in empathy and really understand what empathy is, in the sense of, I am not trying to become your experience. I'm not trying to have your experience be my experience. I might be remembering if you say that you're experiencing sadness, I may remember sadness and what it feels like in me. But the most that I can actually do is just be with you while you are sad. And so while you do this work, I am so grateful, even for the folks who continue. But I think about my early days of really exploring internalized racial subordination. I had some friends and colleagues, and now what I would call family, who said, oh, we're not going anywhere. We see you working this out. I could cry at the gift that they gave me, because they were just there with me. And so it's not the support. We think that support has to look like, well, I'm going to help you with this. The help sometimes, particularly as this work cannot be done by anybody for you. It can only be done by you, but I sure can do it with others. A lot of great questions. Thank you all. It's the end of the time. I always want to respect people's time. Please reach out. My information is there. Yeah, love the opportunity. Thank you, NCORE, for having me. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Tanya. That was fantastic.
Thanks.